This video will help you figure out the right amount of life insurance you should have on the balance sheet. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. One core aspect of auditing or executing a financial plan is ensuring the right amount of life insurance exists to protect the family, loved ones, etc., in the event that someone's income or value is no longer a part of the family. So in today's video, we'll touch on 3 of the most common approaches of determining the right amount. So let's jump in. Technically speaking, nobody needs insurance. It's more so trying to match their values with a potential gap on the balance sheet of money. So colloquially, I'll probably use the word need, but just know that in reality, it means want. The 3 most common methods I see out there to value how much insurance somebody needs on the balance sheet is going to be, number 1, the income multiplier method. Number 2, the DIE method or DIME method, which is purely coincidental. I didn't invent it. And then number 3 is going to be the human life value method. So let's start off with the first one. It's the simplest one to understand. It's the income multiplier method. I would boil this approach down to simply giving you a barometer as to whether or not you're in the ballpark of having enough insurance. This is where you take someone's salary or annual compensation and multiply it by 10. Some folks will use 15. Online you could see 20, but to keep it simple for today's purpose, we'll use 10. If someone makes 10 grand a month or 120 grand a year, they should probably have at least somewhere in the ballpark of 1.2 million bucks of life insurance. There's a number of drawbacks to using this approach, however. The first and most obvious one are for folks that don't earn an income. I guess they don't need life insurance, which from experience I can tell you could be no further from the truth, that whether or not somebody earns an income doesn't really dictate whether or not they should have life insurance. There's tremendous value that even non-income earners in the family bring to the equation. This also means that as you continue to make more and more money, you should buy more and more insurance, which taken to the logical extreme means the person in the year before they retire should have as much life insurance as they've ever had in their entire life. From a financial planning standpoint, that's probably not the case because odds are if you're the year before retirement, you also have the highest net worth you've ever had before. And if you've got kiddos, they might be grown on their own, they have their own families. Odds are you no longer need to directly provide for them financially. So that if you did pass away, your assets would do quite a bit of the legwork and you wouldn't need additional cushion on top of that via life insurance. Also, this should bring us peace of mind because as you get older, life insurance dollar for dollar gets more expensive. And so this should hopefully save you some money. I think the best case to use this is simply to get a barometer as to, do you have in the ballpark enough insurance? If you make 10 grand a month, 120 grand a year, you should probably have at least 1.2 million of life insurance. Next up is the DIE method or DIME method as it's sometimes called. This is my personal favorite, coincidentally, because it's the most intuitive and I feel best relates somebody's goals to how much life insurance they need. DIE stands for debts, income, and then education. And sometimes you'll see the equation represented as DIME, where they add an M here, and the M stands for mortgage. But a mortgage is a form of debt, so using the DIE method is, in my opinion, just simpler, even though DIME sounds cooler. First, you add up all of your debts: student loans, mortgage, credit cards, personal loans, home equity lines of credit, etc. Technically speaking, you could leave out the loans that would be forgiven on death, like some student loans and some other types of debt. Or you could even leave off debts that are going to get paid off very soon. Maybe you took out a 0 interest loan to buy a TV or a car or something like that, and you're near the end of paying that off. You could probably leave that off the equation for simplicity. Either way though, you add up all your debts and that's the D. Now you go determine how much income the family would need now that you're gone, and determine how long they would need it for. The simplest way to do this is simply just to replicate your salary for a particular duration of time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, etc. But some caveats to that. Number 1, life insurance is received tax-free. So really, you don't need to replace your whole salary. You just need to replace the net salary after income taxes apply. You can also further reduce that number by the amount of your salary you were using to pay off the debts. Because since all the debts are gone, now whatever income you were using to pay on those debts, you no longer need to bring back into the family equation. On the contrary, however, to reducing how much income the family needs to get replaced, you might also want to increase that number by all the additional expenses that could apply now that you're no longer here. Especially if there are younger kids in the mix, odds are you're going to have some additional expenses. If, for example, one of the spouses does all the cooking, the cleaning, maybe the shepherding to and from soccer games, whatever, Unless you're going to take time off work to do that now yourself, which probably would result in less income, you're probably going to want income around to hire out those ancillary services. Maybe you'll do more delivery, more takeout. Maybe you'll hire a nanny. Maybe you'll hire a house cleaner, things like that. You're going to probably want to add that back into the equation. And while this technically isn't a form of like replacement income, I pretty much always advise that somebody add in, I'll call it like a grieving cushion, which just means, hey, for the next few months or years even, you might want to have some additional income just so you don't have to stress financially during the time that you're making some changes. Lastly, we add to the equation the cost for any sort of education goals or really any major expenses that were going to happen at some point in the future. You add that back into the equation as well. Keep in mind, those costs might be higher in the future in real dollars than they are today. And we'll touch on an example next on how to factor all that in. So ultimately, we've got the debts, the presumed income we'll need to replace, as well as education or major expenses. Let's run through an example using a young couple that has twin 8-year-olds. Let's say as far as debts are concerned, they have a $500,000 mortgage, but that's their only debt. Let's say from an income standpoint, spouse one was earning 10 grand a month, and after doing a bunch of math, they decided they want 10 grand a month to continue. And let's say they decide they want 10 grand a month for 10 years. Now, nominally or statically, 120 grand a year times 10 years equals $1.2 million of insurance. But that's going to be a little bit overkill for how much insurance to buy in the income section, because if all of the money that we need for future income is received today, well, you can actually invest a good portion of that. And if you assume like a 7% growth rate on those investments, then you don't need 1.2 million, you need a smaller number. This is called present valuing the expected cost in the future. Technically speaking, you'll need to run a present value of a growing annuity due calculation, which you can do by hand if you have a lot of free time, or you can click below, I'll link you to the online calculator that I use, where essentially you can present value the future income stream, knowing that inflation exists, and that income stream, or 10 grand a month, is probably gonna inflate to need to be a much higher number to have the same level of purchasing power. If we use the calculator below, assume a 7% rate of return and like a 3% average inflation rate, as opposed to 1.2 million of life insurance in the income section, the family really only needs about $1 million. From an E or education standpoint, let's say the only major expense they wanted was education at 30 grand a year to provide for each one of their kids for 2 years. So that's 30 grand a year times 2 years, 60 grand, times 2 kids is 120 grand. So again, nominally, 120 grand would need to be added to the equation. In reality, however, again, if we have a lump sum amount of money today that we can invest in the future, we don't need 120 grand. Keep in mind, however, the cost of education goes up as well. Technically, what you'll need to do is take that 120 grand today and run a future value equation, assuming that money grows every year until the kids are 18, which is in 10 years, to determine the right amount of future value. We then need to present value, assuming we can invest that present value money, and that's the amount of money you want to add to this equation. If we assume college expenses go up by 3% a year, then when the kids are 18, instead of needing 120 grand, you'll actually need about 161,000. But if you present value 161,000 to today and assume you could invest the life insurance reserved for this goal, you don't need 161, you don't need 120 grand, you actually only need about 82,000. You add all these up and the result is like 1.58 million or 1.6 million to keep it simple. If we compare this result to the income multiplier result we did previously, if spouse one earns 120 grand a year, they'd need 1.2 million. But if we take the more sophisticated die approach, in my opinion, you're gonna get a result of 1.6 million. So a higher life insurance number. The last method to value how much life insurance somebody needs is to use the human life value equation. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this method because it's a lot of math, but then also intuitively it assumes a tremendous amount that probably is inaccurate, and it results in a huge life insurance need compared to the other two examples, and I'll show you the math in a second. There's different flavors to run a human life value projection, but essentially what you do is you take your annual compensation, you assume it grows at least by inflation and projected raises in the future, and you're trying to present value replace the amount of money you will make every year until the year in which you stop earning money, or your human life value stops. Now, we're not going to get into the philosophy as to whether or not someone's human life value is a result of how much income they'll make. One, because it's a great way for me, if I were to tell my wife we're doing this method, to sleep on the couch for the next week. But then also two, there's again a lot more to someone's human life value than simply how much income they bring into the equation. That said, I promised to show you the math, so let's jump into that. If we assume the same young couple family with 8-year-old twins, and let's say spouse one makes 10 grand a month, and let's say they're 30 years old, so maybe 30 more years of working career expectation. Nominally, if you multiply 120 grand a year times 30 years, you're gonna get $3.6 million of life insurance needs. To get the present value number of how much life insurance you would need to buy, you're actually gonna go back to that present value of a growing annuity due calculator I'll link below. And if we assume that spouse one's income at least grows by 3% of inflation every year for the next 30 years, and if they had the money today and could earn 7% in an investment account with that money, along that 30-year career history, pulling out 120 grand every year plus inflation, the present value turns out to be around $2.2 million, which is 600 grand more life insurance than the die method and about $1 million more life insurance than the 10x salary method. I'm not a big fan of this method because it assumes one, spouse one only makes inflation raises. It assumes they work until 60. It assumes that the other spouse that doesn't bring an income in has no human life value, which is absolutely not true. So I'm just not the biggest fan of this. A quick note on how to own this amount of insurance on the balance sheet. We don't have time to get into specific product designs, but for the most part, my go-to recommendation when there is a large life insurance need is to use term life insurance on the outset and then have a more nuanced discussion over the years as to whether or not permanent life insurance makes sense. Term life insurance is the most cost-effective way of achieving a large amount of protection for the smallest out-of-pocket cost. Permanent life insurance, on the other hand, which is probably a good tool for less than 1% of the population, would be able to keep this life insurance on the balance sheet forever. And really, you're only gonna need that life insurance on the balance sheet forever if you have a super illiquid estate, or you're gonna run into some estate tax consequences. And I'll link above here to explain a video on how you can use life insurance for that purpose. But for the most part, buying term insurance is gonna be totally fine, and you can have a more nuanced discussion about other insurance types later on. So from a cost to action standpoint, I would audit to see if you have the right amount of life insurance on your balance sheet relative to your goals. In our office, we review the life insurance policies with our clients every 2 years, matching it with their goals, because as things change, your need for life insurance might go up and it might go down. It could stay the same, but generally there's gonna be some changes to be had at least every few years. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, feel free to get in touch on the website or through my other social media platforms. I've had to pause comments down below, so we just can't communicate via the comments for now. But again, if you need help, reach out. We'll help you at least get squared away. Have an awesome rest of your day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.